Before dawn, on a flat plain in northern Mesopotamia, two men stood on the edge of history. One was the king of the largest empire on earth, master of lands that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of Central Asia. The other was only 25 years old, far from home, outnumbered, and already carrying the reputation of someone who did not seem to believe in limits. When the sun rose over Gaugamela on October 1st, 331 BCE, this was not just another battle. It was a collision between two worlds, two futures, and two ideas of power. By nightfall, one empire would begin to die, and another age would be born. The ground itself had been prepared for the moment. Darius III, great king of Persia, had chosen the field carefully. He wanted open space, wide space, killing space. He ordered the plain leveled so his cavalry could move freely, and his scythed chariots could tear through enemy lines. This was supposed to be the place where the invader finally broke. This was supposed to be the battlefield where Alexander of Macedon learned that speed, courage, and legend could only carry a man so far. But Alexander had not crossed half the known world to stop here. To understand why Gaugamela mattered so much, you have to go back before the dust, before the shouting, before the first spear dropped. You have to go back to Macedon, a kingdom many Greeks once looked down on. It was rough, hard, and hungry. But under Philip II, Alexander's father, it became something far more dangerous than a famous city. It became a machine for war. Philip rebuilt the army from the ground up. He trained men to move as one. He armed them with the long sarissa, a pike so massive it could turn a wall of infantry into a forest of death. He shaped cavalry into a weapon of shock and precision. He united Macedon, bent much of Greece to his will, and prepared a great campaign against Persia. Then, at the height of his power, he was murdered. Into that storm stepped Alexander. He was young, brilliant, and already tested in battle. But the moment he became king, the world did not bow. Rivals watched. Greek cities wavered. Enemies waited for weakness. Alexander answered with speed so violent it felt like prophecy. He crushed revolts, destroyed Thebes as a warning, and made it clear that Philip's death had not weakened Macedon. It had unleashed something even more dangerous. Across the Hellespont, he went in 334 BCE, carrying a war his father had planned, and a dream that quickly became something larger than revenge. Officially, he came to punish Persia for old invasions of Greece. In truth, he came to conquer. At the river Granicus, he beat Persian forces in his first major battle on Asian soil. At Issus, he faced Darius himself and shattered the Persian king's army. Darius fled, and for the first time, the great king tasted humiliation at the hands of a foreign invader. That should have been enough to end lesser men. It was not enough for either of them. Darius still had an empire. Alexander, meanwhile, did not rush blindly inland. He understood something crucial. Persia was not just an army. It was a system. It was ports, supply lines, treasure, and the sea. So instead of charging east immediately, he moved down the Mediterranean coast, taking city after city and stripping Persia of the shoreline that helped hold its empire together. Tyre was a fortress island, rich, proud, and seemingly secure. Alexander demanded entry. Tyre refused. What followed was not simply a siege. It was an obsession. He ordered a causeway built across the sea itself, pushing earth and stone into the water under constant attack. Towers rose. engines advanced, ships gathered, and months of brutal effort turned stubbornness into inevitability. When Tyre finally fell, the message thundered across the eastern Mediterranean. Resistance might delay Alexander, but it would not stop him. Gaza fell next. Egypt opened without a major fight. There, Alexander was welcomed not as a destroyer, but as a liberator from Persian rule. He founded Alexandria, and by the time he marched out of Egypt, he was no longer just a Macedonian king leading a bold campaign. He was becoming something bigger in his own mind and in the minds of others. A conqueror favored by destiny, a man the world was beginning to treat as more than mortal. But destiny still had to meet Darius one final time. After Issus, Darius had offered terms. Alexander refused them. He would not settle for part of Asia. He wanted all of it. So while Alexander secured the coasts and gathered momentum, Darius rebuilt. He summoned forces from across the empire, cavalry from the eastern satrapies, guards around his person, contingents from many peoples and regions, all brought together for one last effort. If Persia could not crush Alexander in the mountains or at the sea, it would do so on ground built for Persian war. In the summer of 331 BCE, the two powers moved toward each other once more. Alexander marched into Mesopotamia. Days before the battle, a lunar eclipse darkened the night sky, and men searched for their future in the shadow on the moon. Then came the final approach. Darius had selected the plain near Gaugamela, east of the Tigris, not far from Arbela. He had the ground flattened. He set out his forces in immense width. Ancient sources disagree wildly on exact numbers, but the truth is clear enough. Alexander faced a much larger host. Darius wanted to stretch him, envelop him, drown the smaller Macedonian army under pressure from every direction. Alexander saw the battlefield and understood the danger immediately. According to tradition, some urged a night attack. It would have been practical, perhaps even wise. A smaller army could use darkness to erase the enemy's advantage. But Alexander refused. He wanted a clear victory and full view of both armies. More importantly, while Darius kept his men tense and awake, expecting an attack in the dark, Alexander let his own army rest. By morning, the Persians were tired. The Macedonians were ready. That difference, invisible in the night, would matter when the world began to move. Imagine the scene as dawn breaks. On one side stands the Persian king, Darius III, center of a vast imperial army, surrounded by nobles, guards, cavalry, chariots, and the weight of generations. Persia was no fragile state. It had ruled for 200 years. It had absorbed nations, managed roads, tribute, palaces, and power, on a scale the Greek world had rarely imagined. Darius was not commanding only soldiers. He was commanding the prestige of empire itself. On the other side stands Alexander. He places himself on the right wing, where he can lead the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen who have become the spear point of his victories. His veteran general, Parmenion, holds the left. In the center stands the phalanx, bristling with long sarissas, disciplined, stubborn, and deadly. Behind and around them are lighter troops and reserves, men placed not only for frontal combat, but to answer the one nightmare Alexander knows Darius is planning: encirclement. This is important. Alexander is not walking onto the field, hoping courage will save him. He is thinking several moves ahead. He knows the Persians will try to overlap his line, swing around his flanks, and crush him from the sides. So he arranges his army with depth, angles, and flexibility. Even before the first clash, the battle has already become a contest of minds. Then it begins. Alexander does not rush straight forward. Instead, he moves to the right, diagonally, drawing the Persian line with him. At first glance, it looks strange, almost hesitant. But it is a trap. By drifting sideways, Alexander forces Darius to extend farther and farther, to keep pace, to open space, to lose some of the tidy order the king had prepared on the flattened ground. The battlefield starts to stretch. Pressure builds, dust rises, lines shift. Darius answers. He sends cavalry forward. He launches the scythed chariots, one of the most terrifying weapons in the Persian arsenal. Picture them, blades fixed to the wheels, racing toward packed infantry, built to slice through flesh and formation, to turn discipline into panic. But Alexander's men have drilled for this. As the chariots thunder in, the Macedonians open lanes, throw missiles, and strike the horses. Instead of smashing the phalanx apart, many of the chariots pass into spaces prepared for them, where they lose momentum and become isolated, trapped, or destroyed. One of Darius's great prepared advantages starts to fail in front of his eyes. Still, this is no easy victory, far from it. The Persian cavalry attacks hard, especially against the Macedonian left. Parmenion is under terrible pressure. Dust, noise, screaming horses, splintering spears, men crushed under hooves. The edges of the battlefield are becoming a storm of close-range chaos. At moments, it looks as if the Persian plan might work. Parts of the Macedonian line bend. Openings appear. Some Persian forces push through gaps and even make for the rear. This is the kind of battle that can collapse in a minute. And this is where Alexander makes the move that changes everything. He has been waiting for a break, not in the enemy's courage, but in the enemy's shape. As the Persian line extends and churns under the strain of matching his movement, a gap opens near the center left of Darius's position. It is not huge. It is not dramatic. In many battles, such a moment would pass unnoticed in the dust. But Alexander sees it, and he strikes. With the companion cavalry formed into a wedge, he drives forward at speed toward the weak point, not away from danger, but straight into the heart of it. This is the Alexander his soldiers know, the one who does not command battle from safety, but enters its most violent point himself. Around him ride some of the finest cavalry in the ancient world. Behind and beside them, infantry presses forward. The line of battle becomes a wound, and Alexander pushes his blade into it. Now the battle turns from collision to crisis. Because Alexander is not just breaking troops, he is making for Darius. That matters more than numbers. In ancient warfare, armies often held together through the presence of their king. Kings were not distant symbols. They were visible centers of order. If the king stood firm, the army could still believe. If the king fled, panic could spread faster than any messenger. And Darius has been here before. At Issus, he had seen Alexander come at him like a force of nature, and he had fled. The memory cannot have left him. Now, at Gaugamela, amid the noise and dust and collapsing space, the same nightmare is happening again. The Macedonian wedge is driving toward the center. Guards are under pressure. Confusion surges. The enemy king is closing. This is the moment on which empires hinge. Darius loses his nerve. Whether he believed he was preserving himself for another fight, whether his advisors urged retreat, whether the danger simply became too immediate, the result was the same. The great king turned and fled the field. The effect was devastating. Once Darius began to run, the center of his army started to break. Fear moved faster than commands. Men who had stood in the confidence of a giant host suddenly saw not strength, but exposure. What had looked immense now looked fragile. What had looked like an empire now looked like a crowd. But the battle was not neatly over. Not yet. Alexander faced a terrible choice in the middle of success. Ahead of him was the fleeing king, the living symbol of Persian resistance. Behind and to his left, Parmenion was still under crushing attack and in desperate need of support. Chase Darius and perhaps end the war at once. Turn back and save part of your army, but risk letting the king escape. Alexander turned back. It is one of the most revealing moments of the day. Great conquerors are often remembered for the charge, the gamble, the flash of glory. But command is also about knowing when your victory is still fragile. Alexander wheeled toward the threatened sector, where the fighting remained savage. Persian cavalry fought hard. Some of the most dangerous moments of the day came after Darius had already fled. Eventually, though, the structure of Persian resistance collapsed. What began as a grand imperial battle ended in fragments, flight, and pursuit. The field belonged to Alexander. At Gaugamela, a smaller army had destroyed the last full-scale attempt by Persia to stop him. Gaugamela decided the fate of the Achaemenid Empire, one of the greatest empires the world had yet seen. After this battle, Alexander could move into the imperial capitals. Babylon opened to him. Susa followed. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian kingship, would fall into his hands. The treasures of empire, the roads of empire, the symbols of empire, all of it was now within reach of the Macedonian king, who had crossed into Asia with an army tiny compared to the size of the world he intended to take. And yet the story is not as simple as one charge ending everything in a single afternoon. Darius was still alive. He fled east, hoping to raise resistance again. Persian authority did not vanish the instant the battle ended. Alexander still had to march, occupy, negotiate, punish, reward, and fight. The empire he had broken was too vast to disappear in a clean cinematic cut. But Gaugamela had changed the balance beyond repair. Persia could still resist in places, but it could no longer convincingly claim mastery over Asia. The center had been pierced. The king had fled. The spell was broken. There is something deeply human in the contrast between the two rulers after the battle. Darius had inherited a throne burdened by crisis and impossible responsibility. He was not the cartoon coward that later legend sometimes makes him. He returned after Issus. He rebuilt after defeat. He gathered another great army when many kings would have surrendered to despair. That took resolve, but Gaugamela exposed the limit of his kingship. At the decisive instant, he could not turn the empire's size into battlefield control, and he could not keep his nerve when the enemy aimed directly at him. Alexander, by contrast, seemed almost built for that exact moment. He thrived where risk became unbearable. He had the kind of leadership that pulls men forward because it appears to deny fear itself. Yet that same quality carried danger inside it. The man who could win Gaugamela by charging into the center of history was also the man who would keep pushing farther than prudence, farther than exhaustion, farther than almost anyone else would have dared. That is part of why this battle matters so much. It was not simply the destruction of an old empire. It was the release of Alexander into a new phase of his ambition. After Gaugamela, he did not behave like a raider who had won a rich prize and would now go home. He acted like the successor to the Persian kings. He entered Babylon in triumph. He took on elements of Persian royal style. He pursued Darius not just as an enemy commander, but as a rival claimant to universal rule. When Darius was eventually killed by his own men during the desperate retreat eastward, Alexander sent the dead king for royal burial. In that act, there was politics, certainly, but also a message. The old king was dead. The new king of Asia had arrived. Because battles are not only about who lives and who dies that day, they are about what becomes possible afterward. Alexander's victory opened the core lands of the Persian Empire. It gave him access to immense wealth that could fund further campaigns deeper into Central Asia and eventually toward India. It shattered the political order that had dominated the Near East for generations. It helped lay the foundations of the Hellenistic world, a vast zone of exchange in which Greek language, ideas, art, political forms, and military traditions spread across territories that had once answered to Persian kings. Cities would rise, trade would intensify, cultures would mix, clash, blend, and transform one another. The world after Gaugamela was not Greek replacing Persian in a simple line. History is never that clean. Persian traditions survived. Local cultures remained powerful. New kingdoms emerged after Alexander's death. But the old balance was gone. A new age had begun, and Gaugamela was the hinge. On that plain, the victory of Macedon did not just redraw borders. It changed the cultural map of the ancient world. The routes of power from the Mediterranean to Asia were reordered. Greek became a language of influence across huge distances. The kingdoms that rose from Alexander's conquests carried ideas, coinage, urban models, and networks that would shape the centuries to come. In time, Rome itself would inherit a world already transformed by the shockwave of Alexander's victories. And still, for all those vast consequences, the battle can also be seen in close detail, in the private fears of people whose names are lost. Think of a Persian horseman in the dust, hearing that the king has turned away. Think of a Macedonian infantryman locking his sarissa into place, waiting for the chariots. Think of the men on the left with Parmenion, holding on while the center of the world seems to shift somewhere beyond the haze. Think of the split second when Alexander sees the opening. Think of Darius looking up and realizing that the enemy king is coming for him again. History often feels inevitable when we tell it backward. It was not inevitable on that morning. Alexander could have misjudged the field. The chariots could have caused panic. The Persian cavalry could have enveloped the Macedonian line. Parmenion's wing could have collapsed. The gap in the center might never have opened. One thrown spear, one dead horse, one moment of confusion around Alexander, and the entire story of the ancient world could have bent another way. That is what makes Gaugamela so gripping even now. It is a reminder that history's largest turns can hang on human decisions made under unbearable pressure. Alexander's decisions that day were not random acts of heroism. They were built from preparation, discipline, and a mind that understood timing with almost unnatural clarity. He used movement to distort the enemy line. He neutralized the chariots. He trusted his army's training. He recognized the critical opening. He aimed not at the edges of the Persian army, but at its political heart. In that sense, Gaugamela was not won by courage alone. It was won by the fusion of nerve and design. Darius, meanwhile, made reasonable choices that became fatal once they met a better battlefield mind. The ground he chose made sense for cavalry and chariots. The size of his army should have been an overwhelming advantage. He prepared carefully. But he faced an opponent who could turn preparation into rigidity, size into overextension, and imperial confidence into panic. Darius built a battlefield for Persian strength. Alexander turned it into a stage for Persian collapse. When we talk about the battle that changed everything, it is easy to speak only in the language of brilliance and destiny. But for the men on the ground, Gaugamela meant terror, trampling, screams, pursuit, and death beneath a sky that did not care who won. It meant the beginning of one empire's end and the violent birth of another man's dream. Still, no matter how we judge him, Gaugamela remains one of the clearest examples in history of a single battle altering the direction of civilization. Before it, Persia was still the great imperial fact of the Near East. After it, Alexander was. Before it, the invasion of Asia could still be imagined as a bold campaign with uncertain limits. After it, it became the overthrow of an empire. Before it, Darius might still hope to recover authority. After it, he was a king in flight. And maybe that is the deepest reason the battle continues to fascinate people more than 2,000 years later. It contains all the elements that make history feel almost too dramatic to be real. A young conqueror against overwhelming odds. A giant empire making one final stand. A battlefield chosen with care. A sleepless night. A sunrise charged with fate. A tactical masterpiece hidden inside chaos. A king fleeing. A civilization turning on a single crack in a battle line. It feels like myth, but it happened. Some battles are famous because they are large. Some are remembered because they are bloody. Some matter because they save a state or destroy a dynasty. Gaugamela does all of that, but its true power lies in its consequences. It was the moment when Alexander stopped being merely the invader of Persia and became the ruler who could claim to replace it. It was the moment when the Achaemenid Empire, for all its resources and history, lost the ability to stop one man and the army that believed in him. And belief mattered. Alexander's soldiers had marched enormous distances. They had crossed rivers, deserts, mountains, hostile territory, and the limits of what most armies would endure. Why did they keep going? Training mattered. Loot mattered. Fear mattered. But so did the strange magnetic force of confidence. They believed their king could see what others could not. They believed he would not ask them to go where he would not go himself. At Gaugamela, that belief was rewarded in the most spectacular way possible. Darius's men, by contrast, fought for a state that was vast but uneven, rich but stretched, powerful but dependent on the king's visible steadiness. Once the center shook, once the king fled, the emotional architecture of the army gave way. Armies do not break only because bodies fail. They break because faith fails. At Gaugamela, Persian faith broke first. When the dust settled, the meaning of the day did not announce itself all at once. Yet even then, the scale must have been obvious. The road to Babylon lay open. The treasures of Susa would follow. The palaces of Persepolis would soon be entered by foreign boots. The old imperial order, which had seemed permanent from a distance, had been forced to reveal that it too could die. That is one of history's eternal lessons. Nothing looks more eternal than a power that is about to fall. At Gaugamela, Persia still looked immense. It still had banners, cavalry, gold, and memory. It still had the title of Great King. But underneath all of that, it had met an enemy with sharper cohesion, sharper command, and sharper will at the crucial point. Alexander did not defeat Persia by being more numerous. He defeated it by being more concentrated, more focused, more disciplined, more decisive, more relentless in the instant that mattered most. In later centuries, people would remember the glamour of Alexander, the romance of the charge, the picture of a world-conquering hero cutting through the center of an empire. But perhaps the most important truth is simpler. Gaugamela was the triumph of an army that could execute under pressure, led by a commander who could read battle like a language and write his answer before the enemy understood the question. That does not make Alexander superhuman. It makes him terrifyingly effective. And effectiveness on a battlefield can change the fate of continents. So when we call Gaugamela the battle that changed everything, that is not exaggeration. It changed who ruled the richest lands of the ancient Near East. It changed which culture would spread across a huge part of the known world. It changed the future of trade, kingship, warfare, language, and political imagination. It accelerated the collapse of one imperial order and cleared the path for another. It transformed Alexander from a brilliant invader into the man who could call himself King of Asia. All of that began with a movement to the right, a gap in the line, and a charge at exactly the right moment. A battlefield is just earth until human ambition turns it into destiny. At Gaugamela, a flat plain became the place where an old world cracked open. The Persian Empire did not vanish in an instant, and Alexander's own empire would not outlive him for long in one piece. But the age that followed bore his mark everywhere. The shock of that day kept moving long after the bodies were gone. Because beneath the armor and banners, it speaks to something permanent in history. The rise of a challenger, the overconfidence of the mighty, the razor-thin line between order and collapse, the terrifying power of a leader who knows exactly when to strike, the moment when the future is decided before most people on the field even realize it has happened. When the sun set over Gaugamela, it did not just set on a battlefield. It set on the Persian world as it had been, and it rose on Alexander's